Good morning, everybody. Good day. And thank you for coming. Welcome. Today, we would like to talk about compliance and how to be successful with compliance, specifically FedRAMP and GovCloud. They're very complex, very big subjects, and we want to address them from the point of view of why would you even do this? Why would you go FedRAMP? What does that even mean from an overall business perspective? We want to go into a little bit into some of the complications and what to watch out for when it comes to the compliance itself, and then from there leading on into some of the infrastructure, what is important with respect to the infrastructure, what to be aware of, and what to just kind of start keeping an eye out for. So that's what we'd like to do today. And with me today we have AJ Chantot, the CEO of Stratus Cyber. We have Reed Rising, who is our security guru, cloud practitioner from also Stratus Cyber, and then Josh Grant, who's a senior solutions architect from SMS. So we are well represented with business, compliance, and tech today. So AJ, I would love to go ahead and kind of kick things off with you to get started. And my very first question is, can you please define for us, what is FedRAMP?
So FedRAMP is the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. It's a government-wide program that really provides a standard approach to security assessment, authorization, and continuous monitoring, also referred to as ConMon, for cloud products and services. So it's basically there to ensure that cloud service providers, CSPs, meet the necessary security requirements to protect federal data and information systems. And it really is an enabler for sales to the federal government.
Okay, thank you. So that's the definition of it. What are some key strategic considerations people should take into account when thinking about FedRAMP or going FedRAMP?
So the U.S. government, as most of you probably know, is probably the largest customer of products, cloud likely as well. So federal sales can be extremely lucrative for vendors. So really some key strategic considerations to think about when you want to go through FedRAMP and also sell to the federal government is really, does your company or your product have existing federal clients? We've seen a lot of successful companies already have self-hosted versions that are being run by agencies, meaning they have federal paying customers for their products. So that market need is there, which tells you that, hey, FedRAMP will likely be successful for us. So instead of a vendor using their on-prem product, they can use their SaaS hosted solution. Some other key considerations are, do you have existing relationships with agencies that would be willing to sponsor your authorization? That's often a big blocker for CSPs, is getting an agency to sponsor you. So having those established relationships and willingness to sponsor is definitely very necessary. There are a lot of changes with how authorization happens upcoming, with the JAB going away, the Joint Authorization Board, and moving to program authorization, but there's no official guidance out yet on that.
Okay.
And then another key consideration is if you're really just starting out in federal sales on your roadmap, it might really be beneficial to even start with FedRAMP, from the get-go. Build to those requirements, build to that architecture. You don't necessarily have to go through the entire process, but that way you're maintaining a single environment and are really starting with a good security foundation and aren't designing or architecting yourself out of it.
So with that said, especially the risks of architecting yourself out from the future there, what are some challenges when it comes to implementing FedRAMP, particularly from a business perspective?
So some of the key challenges are, really companies trying to tackle FedRAMP themselves. Unless you have personnel that are intimately familiar with FedRAMP, the controls, the guidance, the kind of changing landscape, it's really difficult to be equipped and stay equipped to tackle FedRAMP. And that results in delays, overspending, and we've seen that with a lot of companies we've worked with.
Okay.
You know, for example, we've worked with a $300 million plus company that tried to go about this alone. They had the in-house technical expertise, you know, they have the business acumen, but they still went way over budget and way over time, you know, way more than $1 million over budget and over $1 million and delayed by over a year.
Oh, wow.
And then because of those delays, they got caught in the transition from, you know, Rev 4 to Rev 5 as well.
Okay. That was probably
So that
painful.
was, yes, that was definitely fun. So, you know, we were able to, you know, come in and rebuild their environment from scratch within 6 months. But what that really highlights is, you know, the need to stay on top of FedRAMP, you know, the FedRAMP guidance, but, you know, also be technical experts in FedRAMP and also business experts, you know, ensuring that you're able to help organizations align strategically with, you know, executives, managers, you know, technical engineers, and then also having realistic expectations about the process and being able to communicate that to stakeholders so that there is a, you know, alignment across all parties. Really understanding the end-to-end process, being able to plan your resources effectively, you know, budget, timelines, and, you know, really understand that also audits are never perfect. There's always going to be fixes that need to happen, and, you know, there's a human that's an auditor, so lots of stuff is open to interpretation, and really navigating all of that, as well as ongoing resource planning for, you know, annual audits, continuous monitoring, you know, staying on top of all the FedRAMP updates, and kind of just the general, you know, landscape of the federal and FedRAMP environment.
It does sound like there are a lot of challenges. And with that said, what is the best way you've seen to tackle FedRAMP?
So, like I alluded to, working with a solution provider with proven FedRAMP experience is probably the best way to go about it. You know, even extremely large companies need support. You know, businesses are focused on their solutions and verticals, and, you know, FedRAMP in itself, you know, FedRAMP consulting is an industry and vertical in itself. So it's, you know, really best to leave that expertise up to those industry experts. Other challenges are, you know, cloud service providers and like the FedRAMP marketplace is always changing. The guidance is always changing. So it does take you know, those industry experts to stay on top of that. And for example, you know, even, you know, NIST guidance around, you know, password length, complexity, and, you know, not changing passwords that recently came out. And that we'll probably see that eventually hit FedRAMP. But those are the types of things that, you know, you need experts that it's their job to stay on top of all of this. It's their job to understand how to take complex requirements and translate that and interpret that effectively and be experienced and proven in doing so.
Yeah, it sounds like more than one full-time job is my impression from everything you've kind of said here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, AJ. I would like to pivot now a little bit more to the specifics of FedRAMP when it comes to the compliance. And Reed, I would love to ask you, what are some of the critical things that you have to get right for FedRAMP?
That's a great question. There's just the scope of FedRAMP is just so large. There's a lot of critical things that you want to get right. I mean, if we're just looking at the revision 5 baseline, you know, depending on whether you're opting for a FedRAMP moderate authorization or FedRAMP high authorization, you know, you're looking at over 300, over 400 FedRAMP controls that you need to comply with, right? So the scope is just so large. And even outside of those like hundreds of controls that are defined within the FedRAMP baseline, you do also have to consider the number of documentation that they have out there. Guidances, white papers, you know, for example, in one document, there is federal mandates that are described, 6 federal mandates here that you have to comply with, or else it's a showstopper and your authorization is done for.
Okay. Wow.
So for yeah,
like a
absolutely.
kill switch. It's done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of those showstoppers is FIPS encryption.
Mm-hmm.
FIPS encryption being like a very high encryption standard that you must comply with. If you are offering a SaaS application to the government, you have to ensure that your application users can use PIV or CAC cards, those government ID cards that federal employees have to authenticate to your application. Another form, the critical showstoppers can come in. Another example is what services are you using in your environment. For example, if you're using a cloud ticketing platform, for change management, for tickets, that SaaS service also needs to be FedRAMP authorized, or that's a showstopper.
So it's like a cascading requirement there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it cascades all the way down to things like white papers, which aren't exactly explicitly defined. For example, a couple of years ago, FedRAMP released a white paper about subnetting and network segmentation. It wasn't exactly the most clearly defined document, a bit ambiguous, and it was only recently understood that bastion hosts are a requirement to be, to access your environment. And I've seen a situation where, a company in the middle of an audit came to that realization and then had to really backtrack and, re-architect their networking a bit to fit in bastion hosts, kind of at, almost at the finish line. And so, so there are just so many areas where these critical items take place. There is just one last showstopper I do want to mention, and that relates to vulnerability management. And so FedRAMP, they require you to remediate vulnerabilities that are present in your environment within certain timeframes. For example, for high vulnerabilities, you have to fix them within 30 days. For moderate, 90 days, etc. And so if you are consistently overdue with those vulns, that's also a showstopper.
Okay. Wow. So you have to stay on top of it, and some of them will just stop you dead in the water, is what I'm taking away from that. You mentioned vulnerabilities. You mentioned some encryption as well. One of the things that I know is important is ConMon, or continuous monitoring. So I know it's important. Can you please tell everybody else, well, what is ConMon and why is it so important? How does that affect FedRAMP?
Sure, yeah. So ConMon, there's a lot that falls under it. As you said, it stands for continuous monitoring. And so, what exactly are you monitoring continuously? It's your environment, right? And the scope that falls under that includes your infrastructure. So that would be your virtual machines, your databases, your containers if you are using containerized applications. It also includes your web application. And so that's kind of the scope of what you are monitoring. But there's also how are you monitoring, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the vulnerability scanning, that vuln management plays a big part. You're monitoring those systems for vulnerabilities, tracking those vulnerabilities across their life cycle. And in the case of false positives or risk acceptances that your CSP would need to make, there is a FedRAMP process as well for that called deviation requests, which there's a lot to that. We won't go too deep into that at this moment. So that's one component of ConMon, the vulnerability scanning and management. There's also part of ConMon, system hardening. So the infrastructure, your servers, your containers, your databases, those need to be hardened according to specific benchmarks, such as DISA-STIG or CIS level 2. And then you also have to monitor into those systems to ensure that they remain compliant against those benchmarks. And so that's a second component. A third one is inventory. And so keeping track basically a live updated report of what exists in your environment. In the cases where your environment is more dynamic and modern, say you're using containerized applications, you have auto-scaling groups, your environment, the systems that exist in your environment are going to be changing on a day-to-day basis. And so staying on top of your inventory and making sure it's accurate, that's another piece of it. And so really, Conmon, you're taking all of these pieces, the vulnerability scanning, the inventory tracking, the compliance hardening, and you're taking those artifacts, putting them into a single Conmon package, which you deliver to your sponsoring agency once a month. And it's with your sponsoring agency that you also meet with once a month to discuss that Conmon package. And so there's a lot going on there. It's an ongoing operation, and a decent amount of operational overhead.
Yeah, I was even struck when you were answering by the fact that there were already acronyms coming out, such as STIG and CIS, that we haven't defined in this call, but for anybody watching, that should definitely be a warning sound or like a little bell that like, hey, there is a lot to this. There's layers to it, is definitely what I'm hearing from you, and heard from AJ just recently. What I would love to ask now, and Josh, maybe this also extends a little bit to you as the infrastructure technical expert here, but what are other critical technical and operational challenges that you would see to implement a compliant FedRAMP architecture? So what are there other things out there that people can trip over?
Sure. I already touched on the Conmon operations and kind of the level of overhead that's involved with that. We do see that, CSPs, companies who try to take on Conmon on their own without prior experience or really familiarity with those processes, that can be a real pain point for them. There are also, general operational requirements for FedRAMP, things like regular user access reviews, your review of your ports, protocols, and services that you control, network access control within your environment. And so things of that nature really kind of just add up to increase that operational overhead. And so if you don't already have solutions in place to tackle these operational requirements in a really streamlined way, because there are ways you can automate this, but if you're not familiar with it, then it just becomes very tedious and eats up a lot of time. And so that's definitely an operational challenge, finding ways to reduce the overhead to meet these operational challenges. We also mentioned STIG, the hardening benchmark.
Do you want to define STIG?
Yeah, STIG, and it's a good question, actually. We always just say STIG as part of like the alphabet soup that comes with it, but STIG stands for the Security Technical and Implementation Guide. So that's a benchmark that's essentially provided by the DoD, DISA. And so this benchmark, it is pretty secure. And so another challenge we find is when companies are trying to, I'll say, STIGify, harden their systems to that STIG benchmark, they find that they harden it too much and it breaks their application. And so that's definitely one of the challenges as well. And of course, the FedRAMP requirements in general do have an impact on your design choices for infrastructure. I'd actually like to pass it off to Josh, the infrastructure guru, as far as talking to how FedRAMP impacts the infrastructure design choices.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Reed. So there's a lot of additional factors when you're architecting infrastructure in a high compliant environment. And I'll just kind of touch on one of them right now, and that's the idea of offloading your compliance requirements. Now, every cloud service provider or CSP has some version of a shared responsibility model. And if you're not sure what that is, here's a really basic example. Your cloud service provider is responsible for making sure the physical access to the machines that are storing your data and running your applications is secure, right? They make sure that no one that shouldn't have access to those machines have access to them, the physical hardware. Well, that extends well beyond the physical security layer. That extends in some cases to the operating system running on a virtual machine. So when you are architecting infrastructure for a high compliant environment, you may make a different choice than if it wasn't a high compliance environment. You may choose a platform as a service offering solely so you don't have to worry about the operating system. You don't have to worry about the STIG hardening of it or the updates of it. There are teams of teams at these cloud service providers that's their entire job. So that's one difference, let alone the actual services you're using and are they compliant? How hard is it to configure them to be compliant? How hard is monitoring these services? But Reed, I'm curious, I kind of mentioned operating systems there. So what about operating systems when we're making those types of decisions in our architecture?
Yeah, and it's a great point. So say your company does have an operational requirement to self-host their infrastructure, their virtual machines. You do have to also be careful of the operating systems that you use. I had mentioned FIPS, I think, at the closer to the top of this call, FIPS being that high encryption standard. Not all operating systems support FIPS validated encryption modules, cryptographic modules. So there's a very specific, encryption module that is required. For example, Windows Server 2022. That very recently, in the past 2 months, only became FIPS validated. But prior to 2 months ago, that was not an approved operating system to use with your environment as far as FedRAMP goes. And so that's definitely one of the many technical challenges is navigating all of these requirements, these nuances, that impact your design choices. And there's just so many of them. If you aren't familiar with them, you might find yourself in the middle of an audit, like way down the road, potentially failing it because you didn't realize Ubuntu 22.04 didn't support FIPS or something like that. Yeah.
It's kind of like you might accidentally paint yourself into a corner, is what it sounds like there.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, obviously FedRAMP is a huge technical undertaking with all of these specificities. But keeping with that theme of enterprise cloud environments, how does FedRAMP itself, how does it fit in with industry best practices when it comes to building and running a secure cloud environment?
Sure. There's still a decent amount of alignment for best practices that would apply to commercial building, secure enterprise commercial environments, and ones that are FedRAMP, compliant. Okay. Things like if we're talking like an AWS cloud architecture, having a multi-account structure that implements the principle of least privilege, division of duties. The higher level concept of hardening your systems. Those all exist within FedRAMP. You just have to tweak it just so it complies with FedRAMP. You certainly can still have a CI/CD pipeline into your environment, so you have a good DevSecOps, DevOps practice that is optimized. It's just tweaking it so that it fits within that FedRAMP compliance.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And since we've now started into the cloud enterprise architecture, I'd love, Josh, to ask you a few questions here. What I'd love to do is start out, we're talking about enterprise cloud environments. What do you see as, the major challenges when it comes to these environments, to running them, to building them, architecting them, so on?
Okay, that's a great question. And when I start putting on my enterprise architect hat, I really think about scale. And in this case, not horizontal or vertical scaling of your workloads, but the scale of your teams. How many teams of developers do you have? How many teams of infrastructure engineers do you have? And you're likely to have those teams solving the same problems. And those solutions are likely to be a little bit different from each other. So when you are at that type of scale, you're always going to have some inefficiency. Now, when you're at that scale and you are operating in a high compliant environment, that inefficiency is multiplied. So now not only did you have teams of engineers solving the same problems, but the fact that they came up with different answers to those problems, and those answers all need to be compliant. And now another team needs to modify or validate the compliance of those solutions. You've greatly increased the inefficiency.
Yeah, that does sound very challenging. So what have you seen to be the most effective strategies when architecting and running these environments then, when you've got potential issues like that happening?
Yeah, so I guess I'll say if you have an existing solution, right? If you have a commercial offering and you're looking at getting FedRAMP authorization, well, it's extremely unlikely that you accidentally, developed an architecture and application that are compliant out of the gate, right? So really the question comes up of, do I modify my existing solution to be compliant, or do I deploy a parallel solution that's compliant? And with the developer hat on, your immediate thought is probably dry. Don't repeat yourself, right? Why operate two environments? Why have two different architectures? Why run these things in parallel? That's very inefficient. The problem is the additional requirements of operating in a high compliant environment can really hamstring the commercial operations. And what I mean by that is, when you want to adapt to market changes, when you want to introduce new features, new third-party integrations, new dependencies in the commercial environment, but you can't because you operate one environment, you have all these compliance requirements, you have these hoops to jump through, you're really hamstringing yourself. So what I would say is, if you have an existing solution, I would expect and anticipate to run a parallel compliance solution alongside of that, and likely take your original architecture and modify it and make it compliant and run it in parallel. Now, that's not to say that they're two completely different code bases with no overlap, with no shared libraries, no shared anything. That's not entirely true. But I would caution against the idea that you're going to just do everything in one partition.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you had started to get a little specific there. You used the word libraries, and I know earlier, we had mentioned containers. So I would really love to hear, what are some of those key considerations when it comes to containerization in the cloud, especially with respect to, all the compliance we're talking about here?
Yeah, no, thank you. So containerization is really about packaging your application with the operating system, libraries and dependencies, internal dependencies that it needs to run. And when you do that, you get a lot of benefits. Some of the benefits are scalability, right? I can run multiple copies of my application quickly, right? I'm not spinning up a whole virtual machine. I'm just launching a new application somewhere. Portability, right? It's not entirely true in all cases, but for the most part, you can run the same container image anywhere. And that's very valuable. You could run on-prem, you could run in the cloud, you could run across two different hyperscalers. And efficiency. If we compare containers to virtual machines, every virtual machine that you spin up has this overhead of the operating system kernel and a lot of libraries and a lot of things that aren't actually needed by your application. Well, when you containerize your application, you remove a lot of that. Again, that container image ideally only has the dependencies that your application needs to run. And building off of that is security. That's another benefit. We're reducing our surface area by only having the dependencies that our application actually needs, versus a lot of tooling for operations or for development and so forth. And then lastly, there's a very rich ecosystem around containerization. Scanning tools, other security tools, immutability tools, signing tools, supply chain protection tools. It's very robust. There are lots of options, and there's a lot of material out there to learn how to operate, a nice DevSecOps environment kind of based around containerization.
So thank you. That sounds like, it's a good overview of how containers can fit into a secure and compliant environment. But you just mentioned DevSecOps. So let me now ask you, what about building and running a mature and secure DevSecOps practice? What does that look like?
Yeah. So DevSecOps is really about shifting security left. And what that is opposed to kind of the older ways, you have a development team, they create these applications, they throw them over the wall, as you've probably heard before. And then a security team tacks on security. It's almost the perimeter model, where they say, okay, now let's secure this application that was built without security in mind. So we can shift security to the left and start doing scanning, doing monitoring, all of that as early as possible. So how do you develop a mature practice of that? Well, I would start by looking at the OWASP, which is the Open Worldwide Application Security Project, DevOps maturity model. And you can find that just through Google. It's kind of complex, but they have a nice little, about to help you navigate it, but really assess where you're at. See where you're at, see what some of the next steps are. Don't try to go from 0 to 100 quickly, right? 0 to 100 is probably 0 to failure, right? Look through there, find what is that next step? What is that next bit of incremental improvement you can make? Follow through with that, then do a retrospective. Say what worked, what didn't work. Start with low risk changes, right? Just like if you've looked into the zero trust implementation guidance out there, start with some testing services. Start with something that's not mission critical and make those changes, learn your lessons, and then build up from there.
All right. Thank you, Josh. So I'd actually like now to transition to kind of asking the whole group here, all three of you. We've heard today a lot about challenges and best practices when it comes to FedRAMP. So what are some of the solutions that are out there, and what are some pros and cons of those solutions? What makes something better? What makes something worse? What to keep in mind when looking at particular solutions? AJ, I'll go ahead and start with you. See what you might have as that you would recommend or think about as far as solutions go to everything we've talked about.
Absolutely. So the solutions kind of range from, hey, build it yourself, start from scratch, architect everything, to taking solutions that are, here's a bunch of building blocks and, assemble those building blocks all the way up to, fully managed service. And there's kind of various providers and solutions along the way that kind of do things a little bit differently. You have the option to go into someone else's authorization boundary, which means you're tied to them, but that's kind of the least amount of overhead. You're just like, here's our application, and you go into their authorization boundary. That kind of limits the amount of control you have over things as well. And then actually, maybe going back a little bit, having a landing zone where someone deploys you a full architecture, along with some of the tooling and configuration already there. So there's really the level of effort decreases as you go from the build it yourself from scratch up to the fully managed offering. There's also various flavors, along there too, when you go to fully managed, like, hey, if you want someone to just handle continuous monitoring for you, which is a huge overhead, manage the audits for you, or even manage the entire infrastructure and change management process. So you can kind of pick and choose, what you want out of those offerings.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you. And now I'm actually not sure, Reed or Josh, if either of you would like to chime in here. I know that AJ covered that pretty thoroughly. Josh, what have you seen as far as your area of expertise, which is AWS, when it comes to these environments?
I'll speak to the build it yourself. So on that continuum that AJ discussed, kind of all the way to the left, right? You own everything, you design everything, you build everything. You have the maximum flexibility to tailor everything to your needs. And the one thing that I'll say is this is very complex, right? Earlier, I mentioned teams of teams at cloud service providers who do this stuff. This is not a one-man show. This is definitely a team of experienced engineers to build this out to meet your needs. And I'd say you should really ask yourself, is this differentiating, right? If you choose that you build this yourself, do you actually need to? Do you need the flexibility that is offered by owning the entire stack, basically? And if you don't need it, is it differentiating? Does this help you improve and deliver more value to your customers? Because it is not an insignificant undertaking.
So with that said, Reed, anything that you would add? I know we've had pretty thorough answers here, but you're the compliance guru.
I would say if you're considering which option to go with, whether it be kind of tackling it by yourself, or going with a fully managed service where they do your landing zone and they manage the ongoing operations of that. In my experience, I've seen success with the latter. Deferring, all of that to the experts, the building of the compliant architecture, having the experts perform the ongoing operations, whether it be Kanban, documentation, etc. That's where I've seen companies get successful FedRAMP authorizations.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. And one more. Let me kind of shift it over to you, AJ, again. We haven't spoken specifically yet about SMS or Stratus Cyber, but how are these two companies able to tackle these problems that we've outlined here today?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of going back to the premise of the problem, we've seen $300 million plus companies, try to build it themselves. Like Josh and Reed said, it is very challenging. So how we're able to challenge it is, we're experienced in building and managing FedRAMP environments. We've really seen what works when it comes to, architecture, design choices, running continuous monitoring.
Right.
And also when it comes to, security and compliance, but also keeping production applications up and running in an enterprise environment. So really, as a result of all of our experience and kind of battle tested, sitting in audits and things like that, we've went back and invested a lot of time and resources into developing a highly streamlined solution. And our solution really is a multi-cloud architectural landing zone that is owned by the customer. So we come in essentially using infrastructure as code, build out all of the architecture, networking, identity, security capabilities, and also provide that white gloved managed service. It's not, you do have the option to use that or not, but come build your architecture and we completely run it for you as well. So you always have that human touch on what's going on. And then another thing that we've seen not necessarily related to FedRAMP is also FinOps.
Yes.
So yes, big topic. Large enterprises, they're like, hey, let's deploy this architecture and have oversized EC2 instances and just resources running wild here and there. As you get more and more mature in building and running enterprise environments, cost actually starts becoming very important. That's something we tackle in parallel with security and compliance. The more we can be efficient with your architectures, and cheaper, the happier everyone is.
Yeah. It's a win all around, for sure. Thank you, AJ. So Reed and Josh, AJ has now mentioned this again, and that is landing zone. So would you both mind talking about what is a landing zone? What does this look like? What are all these managed services? What does this all consist of?
Sure. And so I think AJ mentioned a tiny bit of that. So the landing zone, of course, would include the networking of that architecture. As AJ had mentioned, it's a multi-cloud architecture between platforms like AWS and Azure. And so deploying your networking, your servers, your virtual machines or EC2s that are hardened, pre-hardened images against the DISISTIG CIS benchmarks I mentioned previously. It's deploying identity IAM solutions, identity access management solutions with automated processes. It's deploying your SIEM, your security stack, your vulnerability scanners, ensuring that you have appropriate logging and auditing in place. It's really everything, EDR, FIPS encryption. It's really the whole stack and end-to-end process. Josh, do you have anything to tack on to that?
Yeah, I'll throw in another critical piece of a landing zone, and that's a deployment pipeline. So the same way that as developers, we have, for a long time now, used pipelines to test and build and deploy our code. Well, now we do the same thing with infrastructure. And that enables us to do a lot of things. That enables us to scan the proposed changes to our infrastructure for compliance. right? That allows us to scan them for cost optimization. So there is a pipeline in this landing zone that's extensible, where you could add on various tools and so forth, and even security gates. Who's authorized to make infrastructure changes? You can shift that left. You can shift that left to the source control layer and control who can commit, who can merge these changes into a specific branch where ultimately they will be deployed.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Reed. Sorry.
Yeah, just at a high level. So what this offering really is, just to kind of put it all into one package with a nice bow, is the end-to-end process, right? So a company really can just come to us with just their application, and that's all they really need. We basically handle the rest as far as the infrastructure, the security requirements, the compliance, and the documentation.
Okay, great. So it seems to me like I can start to kind of guess the answer to my next question, which again is for Reed and Josh. But what are the benefits here to an organization's developers?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off. And so, yeah, the developers, they can really just focus on, what they need to do. We would work, very closely with them to ensure that, they're developing their application engineering, their application architecture in a way that complies with FedRAMP. And so, implementing DevSecOps practices that align with FedRAMP, shifting left, as Josh had mentioned previously. And because of this landing zone that we've developed is so streamlined, it really allows, the company's team, their application developing team, to really get up and running in a compliant environment a lot quicker. Any other thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, so as a former developer, once a developer, always a developer, I feel like I have that mindset. There are a lot of decisions to be made every day as a developer, especially a senior developer. And there are a lot of technologies to learn and to understand and to quickly learn and understand. So by providing this landing zone, this platform to your developers, you're really allowing them to focus on what's important, right? Developing those applications. You're making the good decisions for them so they can focus on bringing you business value.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Josh, you just mentioned business value. So AJ, going back over to you, we've talked about all these technical benefits. What about business benefits?
So really what all of those technical things really boil down to, it's, making sure your project is on time and on budget, and you're able to drive that federal revenue. That's really what the goal here is to be able to do that, efficiently and effectively. Also, going after FedRAMP, outside of enabling federal sales, it also showcases your company's, reputation and dedication to, being secure. It is a good way to kind of just boost your reputation in the community as well.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. So I think what we've done today we've hit some of those higher level business questions, compliance questions, technical questions. And, it's time to kind of close things up a little bit before we start diving too deep into anything. AJ, I would love to start with you. What closing remarks do you have about what we've talked about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, FedRAMP, like you probably heard, it's a huge and complex undertaking. Even for large businesses, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's definitely wise to go about it with support and not do it alone. It's complex, not only technically, but also strategically and logistically. So it's important to, work with those experts that know how to plan, budget, and execute for FedRAMP, not just here's a technical landing zone, but, that being able to plan, budget, and execute for FedRAMP, is really backed by a highly optimized landing zone and managed services to ensure, like, we help you make sure that process is as painless as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, AJ. So Reed, what closing remarks would you have about, the subject we've covered today?
Yeah, if there's really just one thing I want to emphasize, it would be that if you are considering FedRAMP authorization, you 100% need someone who is or a team who are experts with FedRAMP. There's just the scope of the requirements is so vast. There's so many nuances and interpretations and kind of gray areas of FedRAMP. You really do need someone who's familiar intimately with that framework of FedRAMP that can work closely with your company, your team, to build your environment so you get it right from the beginning. The last thing you want is to invest a bunch of time and money into your effort in pursuing FedRAMP authorization, only to find yourself in the middle of an audit, failing to meet a critical control that is a showstopper and causes you to fail the authorization.
Thank you, Reed. And Josh, what would you close with today?
Yeah, so again, the developer hat back on here. I wouldn't take a team of developers who've never built and deployed a production application and have them do that all on their own without any support or guidance. And with something as complex as FedRAMP, don't do that either, right? Bring in some sort of expertise, have some sort of guidance to ensure that you'll reach success.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, everybody today who is listening and then who's also watching the recording. We appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and end now the webinar, but we will also put up contact information for everybody who's been on this webinar. So if you have any questions, if you want to chat about a particular topic, if you need to know how something specifically works in FedRAMP, please don't hesitate to reach out. We look forward to hearing from you and wish everybody a very good rest of your day.